Good morning, everyone. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm a transition counselor, actually a senior transition counselor with VocRehab Vermont. And I want to thank the Vermont Family Network for having me here this morning. And what I'm hoping I can do is give you some information about VocRehab services and kind of the process that we use to help students who are transitioning out of high school. Okay. So there are a few things that I'm hoping to relay to you today. There are three basic takeaways that I hope that you get from my talk this morning. One of them is to understand the distinction between VocRehab and other services available to your kids when they leave high school. There are a number of services out there with different eligibility criteria. And it can be really confusing, and I've been doing transition counseling for about 9 years now, and I've seen a lot of confusion among you folks, among parents, and even among educators in the school. And so I'm hoping that we can clarify a few things about the differences between VocRehab and some of the other services available. I also want you to understand the eligibility guidelines for VocRehab Vermont, which are generally speaking a lot more general in nature than some of the other options for services that students have when they leave high school. And then finally, I want you to understand the process of how VocRehab works and how we deliver our services. So, VocRehab Vermont is under the umbrella of the Vermont Agency of Human Services, and we receive our funding both from federal and state sources, we are governed here in Vermont or advised by the Transition Council, which is made up of parents, clients, and a number of interested people. And they advise us and kind of vet some of the new things that we like to do or want to do in terms of policy changes and that sort of thing. Under the Agency of Human Services is the Department of Aging and Independent Living. And then finally, under that umbrella is our division of Vocational Rehabilitation. Vocational Rehabilitation is actually nationwide, but in Vermont we have local offices all over the state. And in each local office there are transition counselors such as myself. And essentially what we do is we try to be a liaison with all of the local public schools and even some of the private schools in Vermont. And so essentially there's a transition counselor assigned to every high school in the state of Vermont. When your student leaves high school, there are a few basic choices about services. There's, of course, VocRehab Vermont, and then there's something called developmental services. And I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes on developmental services and some of the at-risk services, but I'm really going, and there's so much that could be said about either of those, and so I'm really going to try to focus on just some of the highlights about those services, and but of course really talk specifically about VocRehab. So developmental services, the eligibility criteria there are that through IQ testing, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, a student must have an IQ of 70 or below and or have autism. And then there are also adaptive behavior assessments that are done. And so essentially a student who has either the IQ criteria or has autism and then has some areas of challenges in these adaptive behavior assessments that are typically done in a student's senior year, determine eligibility for developmental services. Every county has what's called a designated agency, and in Chittenden County, the designated agency is Howard Center. And it's their job to identify students who may be eligible for developmental services, assess eligibility, and then once eligibility is established, they do what they call a needs assessment, which sort of, okay, this student is eligible, now what do they need from us to be successful in life after high school? Those services are typically, in developmental services, the services are typically well-rounded. In other words, they cover the entire scope, or can cover the entire scope of a student's life, and they can be a lifelong kind of service that's available. Once you're eligible and you're in, it can be a lifelong service that's available to you. So, so those are the criteria and a real quick overview of what the criteria are for developmental services. On the other side are services for students who are considered at risk. And those would be students who have typically perhaps have mental health or behavioral health kinds of issues. Sometimes students who are coming out of the DCF programming, sometimes those students are there. And so there are a number of students, and it just suffice it to say, I guess, that there are very specific criteria for eligibility in these programs as well. And I'm just seeing a question coming in, and just, I guess, maybe more of a comment about the IQ of 70. I guess the comment is that it must be considered with a standard error of measurement, and that's a great point. IQ tests are on any given day, in any kind of testing, a student can do well or not so well, and so there is some, there needs to be some variation or allowance for variation in that. So that's a really great point that the writer made. So on to VocRehab services. Eligibility for VocRehab is really quite simple. A student needs to have a documented disability. So documented simply means that it is something that has been diagnosed and there is documentation about that diagnosis. And the spectrum of disabilities that we work with are actually quite broad. They can be folks in the developmental services program. And I probably should have made the point in my earlier slide that you can be enrolled in VocRehab and developmental services and or the at-risk services at the same time. The difference is that, again, developmental disability services are typically a lifetime kind of thing, or can be, whereas VocRehab is a little bit more periodic. And typically some of the at-risk services you can age out of. Typically that age is about age 22. And again, that's very general and it's program specific. So again, so number one, eligibility for VocRehab, any kind of documented disability that proves to be a functional barrier to employment, and a student must, benefit from there must be a vocational benefit from VocRehab services. So it's possible, for example, for a student to say have a learning disability that may not affect their ability to work, and in that case, eligibility for our services might be in question. But typically, I would say in general, if your student is on an IEP in high school, they would likely be eligible for our services. And sometimes students who are on 504 plans are also eligible for our services. And again, we, depending on the documentation and how that disability sort of manifests as a barrier to employment is something we like to look at. This is kind of a simplified transition matrix that some of you may have seen something similar to this, but essentially services are concerned with generally 4 areas of a student's life. And so work, play, living, and learning. We typically deal in the work and learn realms. Our focus at VocRehab is specifically employment, and so all of our services are directed toward either preparing a student for employment, helping a student find employment, and perhaps helping a student keep a job after they've been employed. And so those 3 things around the vocational work that we do are 3 key points. We also work with students who perhaps are interested in getting more training, and that training can be either through college. We support a number of students who are going to college with funding, with help connecting to student services so that they can speak with student services at a given college about accommodations that might be needed at the school. And I would say that careful research on the part of the student and family is really important when you're thinking about college, because colleges vary in their ability to deliver support services to students, and you want to be sure that your student is set up for success. And so that's what we try to do as well, is to understand the reason why a student is interested in going to college and the reality of employment afterward, and we look at things like the debt that a student might leave college with. All of those things are important factors, but probably the most important thing I've seen in my time as a transition counselor is are the accommodations and the ability of a college to deliver accommodations. The other realm that we work in, of course, is vocational training, and that is a pretty broad spectrum of things. It can be a trade-specific kind of thing. There are a number of community-based type programs that we provide some partial funding for and can help direct students to. There's a really good program, for example, at St. Mike's College. It's a culinary program through Sodexo that we help people with funding, etc. If they're interested in learning something about cooking, and then going on from there. So that's just one example of a vocational program. But of course, there are also tech centers. We can support adult students who maybe want to do that second year of a vocational program at one of the tech centers, or maybe they're starting as an adult student at the tech centers. And so there's an example of vocational training that we can support. Again, there's some financial support available to students, and but also, again, the importance there is the ability to support a student. So here's some information about the VocRehab process. Typically, we can be introduced to students at age 16. Honestly, that doesn't always happen, and in fact, doesn't happen a lot, but it's possible that we could be introduced to a student at age 16, which is at the same point at which high schools are required to start the transition planning process for students. And so sometimes we're called in to ask for consultation around some key points around employment that might be considered in a transition plan. But more typically, students are referred to us in their junior year in high school. And then that really is just so that we can obviously be introduced to the student, to begin to learn something about the student. So we like to follow those students along until they're actually ready to leave high school and understand what their goals are, what their skills and abilities are, and I'll say more about that a little bit later. But when a student is ready to graduate from high school, and when I say graduate, I'm talking about actually leaving high school, typically that's the point at when students are formally enrolled with VocRehab. And what we do once our enrollment process is actually quite simple. It's a matter of providing the documentation that we need and also filling out a few forms. So the enrollment process is quite easy. And what we endeavor to do right off the bat is to develop a vocational plan for a student. And that plan starts with goals, obviously. What does a student want to do? And typically goals are divided into both short-term and long-term goals. Short-term goals could simply be developing more job skills. It could simply be getting a job of any kind, whereas the long-term goals tend to be a little bit more around long-term career type orientated goals. And it's certainly not unusual for students to have both, short-term goals. I need a job now, I've got to pay for my cell phone and my car and that sort of thing. But long-term, I want to be a mechanic or something like that. And so, we try to assess where students are in terms of reaching their goal, and then try to assess the support that we can provide in helping them reach their goal. And that support really is what goes into our individualized plan for employment. We develop a plan for every student, and kind of the first step in the process after goal setting is to do some assessment. And part of that is, a job readiness assessment. What are the students' levels of soft skills, the social skills and the social awareness and social intelligence that comes with understanding the differences between the work environment and any other environment, hanging out with your friends, or how you do things at home, that sort of thing. And then, of course, hard skills. What is a student actually capable of doing? And typically these fall into the category of what we call transferable skills. A student may have specific experiences, and we try to look at those skills and see how they can translate and transfer into other types of jobs. And so that assessment is a really important part of developing the plan. Probably our assessments can be both informal and formal. The informal assessments, I feel, tend to be, from sort of a on the ground, in the trenches kind of perspective, working with students. The informal assessments seem to be the most useful assessments when it comes to looking at things like soft skills and hard skills. So those things are observations from work experiences that have occurred during school or otherwise, observations in all kinds of settings, and as I alluded to earlier, kind of assessing, where students at in terms of their social skills. And, family, the student themselves, family members, special educators, support people, conversations with those folks are invaluable in kind of building this picture of a student and developing a plan of action in terms of how to get the student moving toward a vocational goal. Some of the areas of support that we can provide in those plans are, of course, we can do career exploration. Not every kid coming out of high school knows what they want to do. I sure know that I didn't know what I wanted to do when I graduated high school. And, you know, a lot of kids are in that boat. And so doing some more career and job exploration can be part of what we do. And very often, as we all know as adults, you know, our experiences often lead to other types of interests. And so I think realizing that a career and work is a developmental process, just as anything is. It's a maturing developmental process. And so kind of keep in mind when a student graduates from high school where a kid typically is there, and they're kind of all over the map. Some have had work experiences, doing summer jobs, that sort of thing, and have a pretty good sense of the world of work, whereas other students have had little or nothing in the way of actual community-based work experiences. We can provide job search assistance. We are part of a network called Creative Workforce Solutions that includes a really important partner of ours, VABR, Vermont Association of Business, Industry, and Rehabilitation. They work with us to work a little bit more intensely with some clients. But the Creative Workforce Solutions Network is made up of lots of agencies, both who serve people with disabilities and who serve other populations. And these folks are out in the community knocking on business doors and looking for opportunities. Opportunities for our students, but also opportunities to help a business fill their need. We call it a dual customer relationship, whereby, yes, we're advocating for our students. We want our kid to get a job at your business, but there has to be some value to the business as well. This person needs to be able to, you know, accomplish some of the work of the business, generally speaking. So we can help in that process of job search. I've already mentioned support for vocational training in college. That comes in the form of potential financial support, kind of potential readiness and preparation support, and help connecting to student services at a college or a vocational training program. Assistive technology is another area that we can be helpful, either on the job or in college or in a vocational training setting. And again, that's kind of based on what a student might need to be successful and accommodate for a disability. And so that's another area. We're part of course, the Assistive Technology Project here in Vermont, whereby we have some assistive technology professionals who can assess a student's need for assistive technology and make some specific recommendations about that. Sometimes students need tools or equipment or basic clothing for a job, and that's another area that we can support. I'm thinking of a young man who I worked with a while back who went through mechanics training with our support, got a job as a mechanic, didn't have the tools, and that was a requirement of the job. And so we were able to provide some of the basic tools that he needed, and he's still doing very well in that job. Sometimes we make referrals to other services, whether it be related to employment or, of course, although our focus is employment, we do take a holistic view of the folks we serve. And so if a student is in need of, say, mental health services, or in need of information about housing, or in need of information about insurance, we can make referrals to kind of the appropriate agency if that's necessary. There's a question coming in about the dollar amount of support that we can offer, and honestly, that varies. There are maximum amounts, but it kind of varies. It's sort of a need-based thing, and honestly, it's not a lot of money. It's typically enough to pay for things like books and academic supplies, that sort of thing. It's the maximums are different for college versus vocational training. So I think one of the key points here is that every student has an individualized plan, and so the amount of support they need varies per individual. So so it's hard to say exactly what the amounts would be, except to say that there are some maximum amounts in both of those categories, and you know, typically students utilize the maximum amounts. So another question coming in about funding, whether it's increased or decreased over the years for VocRehab. You know, honestly, I'm not well versed in our funding process and how, you know, the amounts we get. I think typically we tend to be kind of level funded, if anything. Typically, we're always being asked to trim and be efficient and be effective, and you know, honestly, I can't answer that question very well, except to say is there, as far as I'm aware, are not a lot of new dollars pouring into VocRehab. Questions about somebody had a question about a $600 figure. That's kind of a base figure for a full-time college student in terms of the support we can provide, and that's per semester. So that's the potential amount that we could provide to a college student. Off the top of my head, and it is different for vocational training, and I'm sorry, but off the top of my head, I'm not sure what the max amount for vocational training is. However, at the end of my talk, I'll put up the VocRehab website, and you can actually navigate from the website to our policy and procedure manual, and that information is listed in there, so it's for the public to see. One of the most important things that we offer is benefits counseling. Many of our students are involved in the Social Security system in one way or another, and it can be a very confusing system. It changes when a student turns 18, and then there are different types of Social Security benefits. There's SSI, SSDI, and so a benefits counselor is someone who can help navigate and provide some advice and information about those things. And I'm very thankful that we have a benefits counselor, because it's a confusing world out there in the world of Social Security benefits, and these folks have an expertise that is really valuable to us and to you as well. So as I think I noted earlier, VocRehab tends to be more of a periodic service, I guess would be a way I would put it. So we enroll a student, they have a plan, we work toward that student achieving the goals in that plan, which is essentially to get a job. And once they have a job, the VocRehab system is such that we would follow them for 90 days in that job, and then assess at the end of 90 days whether or not the job is stable, solid, whether or not the student needs any more support in this job. If the job is stable, if it's solid, and they're really doing well without supports, or don't need any more of our supports, we close that person's case. And the thing about VocRehab is, after that, if a vocational goal changes or something about the job changes, The client can then kind of re-enter, re-access services, establish a new goal, and we develop a new plan and kind of start the process over. So that's what I meant earlier when I said our services are somewhat periodic in nature. And again, that 90 days is kind of a point where we don't automatically close a case. We have a discussion about what makes sense at that point. There's a couple of things that over the years, and actually research shows, in terms of employment, what are the factors of success for a student being actively engaged in an employment career? And these are some of the things that research shows and that I've certainly seen just through experience. One of them is that we want students to be actively engaged in the process. I think this is really important to emphasize while a student's in high school, that we like to see them as part of their IPE meetings, involved and engaged as much as possible in in their own life's planning. And so we're interested in what they're interested in. We want them to learn some independence and self-advocacy skills, and develop job readiness skills. And progressive work experience is something that is a tool that we use a lot of in our work, and it's also used a lot in schools. And generally speaking, research shows that the most successful students in terms of work are students who had some experiences in the home, such as chores, and whether you use a reward system or not, but they have responsibilities at home, and then going into the school setting, maybe having a school-based work experience. But ultimately, what we like to see by the time a student is graduated is that they've had some community-based progressive work experience. We can continue these things, those community-based progressive work experiences, once a student graduates. And in fact, as I said earlier, that's a tool that we use quite a bit. So if a student, say, wants to try, cooking or prep cooking, let's say, and they've had a little bit of training, we're not sure about the environment, we can work with an employer through our CWS network to set up a kind of a trial work experience and see how it goes. And so we set the parameters, we define the goals in that situation, and then we kind of assess what happens in that work experience, and then what needs to happen to better prepare the student for the kind of work that they want to do. There's a question that's come in about whether, if a student is unsuccessful in maintaining employment, can you add more on-the-job support? And that's a really good question. And this is a point where I think we can distinguish between some of our services. Supported employment is not something that VocRehab is equipped to do. And when I say supported employment, I'm talking about a situation where a student or a person has a job coach on the job working with them. That's typically something that's done in the realm of developmental services. You would have a job coach, and that job coach is funded typically through a Medicaid waiver. So if you go back to the eligibility process for developmental services, assuming that a student is eligible for services and the needs assessment is there are some funding priorities that a student needs to meet in order to get Medicaid waiver funding to support that aspect of their post-high school life. And one of those funding priorities is around employment. And so typically, if a student has a job when they graduate high school, an employer-paid job, they are eligible for supported employment supports, assuming that they're eligible for developmental services. Supports we offer are typically through our partner agency, VABER, that I mentioned earlier, and they can advocate for a client, they can communicate with an employer, they can visit the job site, but unfortunately we don't have the capacity to have job coaches on site. And so if we determine that more support is needed, we do have some options. Sometimes we can contract with other agencies to provide the support needed. We can get pretty creative about it. The goal is always to develop as natural supports as possible in a work setting, because again, we want people to become as independent and self-reliant as they possibly can be. So this is our website, and I encourage you all to visit our website. We can, as I said, our policy and procedures manual is there, and there's more specific information about dollar amounts and that kind of thing. But again, please remember that every student has an individualized plan, and so what Johnny gets may be different from what Susie gets, and we do the best we can to base it on what the student needs to be successful. And the nice thing about our plans is they're also fluid. If we're going along and we find that a student doesn't need this but they need more of this, it's very easy for us to kind of change that plan. And so that concludes my presentation about VocRehab Vermont. I guess we have a few minutes. If any of you out there have other questions, I'd be happy to try to field some of those. A question came in about whether or not we have students who have trouble holding on to jobs, and what do we do in those situations? And the answer is yes. We have, I've worked with, and we all work with a number of students who struggle to keep a job. And I guess again, it's a very individualized circumstance, and so how we work with it kind of, again, depends on, I think, what that student needs individually, and whether or not we're in a position to provide those needs or whether there's somebody else there. So we often find ourselves working in teams, even once a student has left high school, working with families, working with counselors, working with other service providers to do some work around what can we do to support this student. Questions are pouring in heavily. Would I prefer to meet with students at 16? And when is a transition plan is first introduced? I'm happy to meet with a student anytime. Again, practically speaking, we don't do any actual work with the student until their final year of high school. Students are required in our education system, the schools are required to begin the transition planning process at age 16. And you could go to the Department they're now the Agency of Education website, and there's some really good information there about transition planning, and I would encourage you all to do that. Does VocRehab measure results, track students over time? We do measure results. Our outcomes are based primarily on the number of people who get jobs. And so I think one of the highlights is that because I work with younger people, I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of a developmental process. And so what typically happens is a student maybe gets that first job and has the experience they have, but typically that leads to something else, either because of problems that develop or because of some realizations that develop about, oh, this is a new interest I didn't know I had, or this is a skill that I'd like to explore. And so, yes, we do measure results. I guess personally, and I think I can speak for many of my colleagues, we're not caught up in numbers as much as trying to do work with individuals on a very human level. And so that's kind of where I'm coming from. If I had a magic wand, what would I like my schools to do better to prepare students for employment? Any recommendations for parents? I think schools can reach out to the community. I think those community-based experiences are extremely important, and that would be something that I would encourage schools to do. Schools are encouraged to be part of our Creative Workforce Solutions Network, and so they can avail themselves of some of those resources. So I think really just, kind of some real basic also social skills training, differentiating between different settings is a really helpful thing that schools could do. And parents kind of, I think, again, the research shows that students who have responsibilities in the home as much as possible tend to be better equipped going into more work-like set situations, whether it be at school or community-based. That's probably one of the biggest things, I think. And, also reaching out to some of the resources that are available to you. How does VR support internships with private companies? Can VR pay company for intern time? That's a tough question. I think typically I haven't supported a lot of true internships, but it's something that would be in the realm of possibility, and I think that would be one of those situations where we would look at that individual situation and what would they need. So the categories of support could be financial, they could be accommodations, talking to the employer about what might be needed to make the student successful. We cannot pay for intern time. We cannot pay any kind of a salary, and so even our progressive work experiences are what we call training offsets. We are not allowed by employment laws and guidelines to actually pay people other than for the expenses that might be incurred. And so really the value in these trial work experiences from our perspective is the experience that's gained. Typical caseload for a VocRehab transition counselor, I would say, is on average 100 to 130. So it's a lot of students to keep track of. And one of the things, going back to what I encourage parents to do and their students, is to reach out. It's really, honestly, it's quite difficult to track 100 students, and so if you need something, I think we would all encourage you to reach out to us and be sure that we understand what your needs are. And someone's correcting me, and that's I believe is the case about the transition plan needs to be in place at age 16, and so that means that process needs to start sooner than that at the school level, and that's something that again, if you go to the Agency of Education website and learn more about transition planning, I think that that can help a parent be more effective in advocating for the transition plan. And please be sure that employment is part of that transition plan. There's a question here about how parents are included in the process if that is the wish of a student. And again, I think that's a very individualized thing. One of the key things we run into is once a student turns 18, unless a parent has applied for and attained legal guardianship, it is up to that student as to whether or not we would communicate with parents. I would say 99% of the time, at least in my experience, there isn't a problem there, that students are usually really okay with having their parents involved, and parents are a valuable resource. Obviously, you know your kids better than anyone, and you can be a real valuable resource in terms of providing us with insight about a student, and sometimes parents are integral in things like problem solving, transportation issues, or other kinds of things. So again, we like to think of it as a team, but keep in mind that once a student is enrolled, they are a VocRehab client, and so whether or not they want us to communicate with other people is really their choice, except in the case of a legal guardian. And even then, there are some issues there. And I think, again, there's another question about parent input. I think that's a really valuable resource for us to understand. Another question: what help is available to a student who may not be able to follow through on the plan you put together? For example, a student who needs help completing an online application or filling out an employment application. Yes, that's a pretty common occurrence, actually, and we do the best we can as transition counselors to sit down with the student and do those applications. We also can utilize our VABER partner for that kind of thing. They can be utilized as a long-term job search support person, but they can also be utilized in a sort of a one-time service kind of thing. So if a student needs support filling out a job application, I could make a referral to VABER and have them do just that. Sit down with the student, help them fill out the application, help them follow through with it, and that sort of thing. Always because of the number of folks we serve, we really do count on a certain level of independence and a certain level of engagement on the part of a student. And so I guess, we really just keep trying to find a way to engage that student. I'm thinking of a young man who had a real problem engaging and sticking with any kind of a plan, but we stuck with it, and we found something that he really was motivated to do. And suddenly the world changed for this kid. He suddenly was getting himself up, getting himself to this place of training, was really excited and enthusiastic about the skill he was learning. And really it's been an amazing transformation. And so sometimes I think it's a matter of finding that thing that is really going to resonate with a student and really motivate them. So I think that's about it for today. Again, I appreciate you all tuning in and listening, and I want to thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This webinar will be archived on Vermont Family Network's website along with many other previously recorded webinars. Be sure to visit VFN's website at www.vfn.org vermontfamilynetwork.org for a complete list of upcoming webinars, workshops, and support groups. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you again.